Gotcha.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my review of Monster Hunter World Iceborne. I was given an early copy of the game, and I've had a chance to play for something over 24 hours, and I've had time to finish the story mode and more. Besides this, I've also played the base game Monster Hunter World for over 3,100 hours, almost every single day I've played since it launched. As usual, with a lot of my videos, I like to jump straight to the point, and this review won't be any different from my other videos. Now, since this is my first time really reviewing any game ever, I did want to mention that I kind of studied game reviews and game reviewers and realized how probably unscientific and subjective reviews typically are, and that they're often their own form of entertainment and speculation. For example, imagine this. Out on the internet, some reviewer has given Candy Crush a 4 out of 5. Somewhere else, a reviewer will give Iceborne an 8 out of 10. Which is the same score, stated differently. Yet we know these games are like miles apart in quality and richness. Candy Crush is a cheap microtransaction game you use to drug your kids long enough for you to get away from them, and now that you're alone, you can play a real game like Monster Hunter. So the goal of this review is to try to talk about Capcom's Iceborne as an expression of its artistry and its mechanics as well, even if I do give it a grade in the end. And I hope that you mostly find my own introspective experiences and thoughts with the expansion useful and satisfying, and not so much the grade. If you end up enjoying the review, and if you want to help me out, be sure to leave a like on the video and share it for someone else to enjoy. Thank you. We're going to break the game into 10 categorical parts, and I've organized them into a top 10 list, with number 10 being the most important category. So when I list these, you might ask yourself if you even agree with the order that I've placed them in. Number 1 is going to be polish. That's bugs, right? Flaws. Number 2, sound effects. Number 3, story. Number 4, multiplayer. Number 5, environment. Number 6, I call it weapons and armor. What I really mean is rewards. Number 7 is music. Number 8 is replayability. Number 9 is monsters. And number 10 is mechanics. Let's officially get started with the review. Number 1 is polish. Polish is how completed the game feels. Some games launch and they feel like a beta version of the game. Beta, and it's as if they're letting you, the consumer, be the beta tester while they run patches to fix all the problems that you're uncovering for them, even though you've already paid full price for a supposedly completed product. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of titles have done this. Capcom does not do this. I had absolutely no bugs or glitches with Iceborne, and this is exactly the same way it was with the base game for me on both Xbox and PlayStation. I will note that the base game multiplayer occasionally experienced problems with connectivity on the PC, so we'll have to find out later if that's a problem for Iceborne on the PC. But Iceborne on PC doesn't come out for a while. It comes out in January 2020. I'm giving Iceborne, PlayStation and Xbox, a 10 out of 10 flawless score and polish. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the game in terms of bugs and glitches. There really never has been, and you have to appreciate this because it's actually very time-consuming, expensive work to get a software product out that is flawless. You have to hire a lot of testers, they have to do a lot of testing, and then you have to do a lot of bug fixing. If you've ever played a game you love, where you both loved and hated the game because it was loaded down with bugs and you're just like pulling your hair out going, how could you have done this to me? And yet you can't stop playing it. You know what I'm talking about. I've played many games of this type. Capcom does not have this problem. It definitely earned that 10 out of 10 grade. Number 2, moving on to sound effects. I'm a huge believer in the importance of sound in a video game. In fact, 1/3, not 1/4, not 1/5, but an entire third of the game. Imagine playing any game with your sound muted for the entire time you own the game, and you understand what I mean. It basically turns that game into a very trashy product. So take Minecraft, for example. Imagine you had never heard any of the sounds or music from that game. It would basically be a husk of its full product. The same can be said for any Mario title or any Pokemon title. In fact, it shouldn't surprise you that usually you find the most iconic games ever made, uncoincidentally, had the most iconic music and sound effects ever made. Now we're going to do a sound effect challenge. You're going to close your eyes and I'm going to play 3 very iconic sounds from over 20 years ago, and you're going to try and name what they're from and what's happening. Did you get them? They were the Mario jump noise, the Sonic ring noise, and the Street Fighter II Hadouken noise. Now I want you to close your eyes and name the most iconic sound effect from Monster Hunter World. My question for you is, in 20 years, will you easily remember that sound? Will that sound be considered an iconic sound that most of the gaming community will recognize? Now I'm guessing you imagined a particular monster roar, or maybe you even heard the handler going, "Hey partner!" Whatever the case is, I think it's important that Capcom keeps experimenting with sound effects that don't just sound realistic for the realistic environment that they've made, but the sound effects that you're not going to be able to forget them, and that's really important. A lot of the sound effects in the game are really high quality. All right, so you have quality sound effects in Iceborne, and they contribute subtly but greatly to the experience of attacking monsters with your weapons, or sniffing a track from Kulf to Roth, or zipping noises from jumping from wedge beetle to wedge beetle. But on the flip side of simply having professional sounds, I would like to see Monster Hunter experiment with the sounds that are even described as addictive to listen to, and very often the addictiveness of a sound is what's causing it to reach an iconic status. I'm giving the sound effects in Monster Hunter World Iceborne an 8 out of 10. They're very professional, and there's been some clear improvements to the way the sound effects are presented based on the varying activities you're doing, so that there's more diversity in the sound effects, and so these sound effects describe what you're doing, right? So one type of damage versus a different type of damage, that's actually been improved on in Iceborne as opposed to the base game. However, I feel that the game does lack addictive sound effects, really strong addictive sound effects, as well as iconic sound effects, which would move the grade up to 9 and then up to 10. Category number 3. Next, we're going to talk about the story. Iceborne is very similar to World in the way that its story tells. Basically, there's some kind of problem, they're investigating it, and by investigating it, what I really mean is you're saving the handler and killing monsters. As someone new to the series, when someone explained to me that there's an actual lore to Monster Hunter, I was genuinely surprised, because the story doesn't really explain the origin of anything at all, in my opinion. And as far as I can tell, we're a bunch of sailors who eat, get drunk, then go around killing stuff right afterwards. Something really lacking from the story is any form of allegory. In other words, any kind of deeper or second meaning. And that deeper meaning could be political, it could be philosophical, or it could be moral. Do you guys remember the children's stories from Aesop's Fables? If you haven't read those, go read those. Aesop's Fables was a set of short stories that you could safely read to a kid, and yet even as an adult, the advice you learned from Aesop's Fables, they still ring true later in life. They're full of a lot of wisdom, because the morals in those stories have a sort of timelessness to them. Monster Hunter could use some of the charm of the story writing from something like Aesop's Fables to do the same thing. Teach us how crafty and dangerous the world is when everything in it is a competition for survival and resources. And of course, the reason you could read Aesop's Fables to your kids, or you could be a kid reading it, is because it was always animals interacting with each other in the wild. So this actually is very similar. I don't want to say similar, but it's something that they could recreate in Monster Hunter World because they're very much into nature, right? They could go another direction and have the writing focus on the indifference of nature. If you've never heard that term, the indifference of nature, it refers to how dangerous nature is and how little it cares about you. Nature's not a bad guy, but it will kill you. So this was the writing style used recently in Red Dead Redemption 2, where a main character suffers from a disease that had not been cured in that time period. Seeing how that particular character is so capable of handling all of his other problems easily through violence, but then watching him slowly defeated by this microscopic, non-violent disease was a huge selling point for the story, because it shows you in a relatable way how powerless we really are against the complexities of nature. And this is another area that Capcom could explore. The indifference of nature is a big one in storytelling, in my opinion. And then on the other hand, there are other philosophical routes to take into the writing, like questions about whether animals feel pain, and does that matter? Or how intelligent does a life form have to be before we start feeling real guilty about killing that life form, right? Those are the questions we ask ourselves in the real world right now. And then we had the Witcher DLC, where they actually have this Pukey Pukey character, and he seems to be kind of aware, or socially aware of Geralt, and you feel pity actually on that monster. But the funny thing is, throughout before the Witcher DLC, you were just killing loads of those guys. So you're sitting there going, well, so what is it? Are these sentient monsters who have feelings and thoughts, or are they like wild evil beasts that we have to take down because they're going to destroy our village kind of thing, right? So Capcom doesn't really address that, and they could spend their whole story just addressing that one thing because it's a deep enough and complex enough of a question, and they just don't. Finally, I would point out that the story lacks any kind of true good or bad kind of guy, which is okay. Stories don't have to be this dichotomy, this epic battle between good and evil, but if there's no moral axioms introduced into the story, then the lives of the characters while the story is unfolding has to be interesting enough that we don't care about the story itself, but about what's going on in the lives of those characters. Yet there's no romance in the game. And who made me so good at this? Why am I so good at killing monsters? What hardships did I have to go through to reach this level of power that I'm killing godlike elder dragons by simply hitting the roll button at the correct time? Do any of the characters ever really experience serious emotional issues like depression, anxiety, or grief? And the answer to all those questions is really just no. It's a story that you could kind of explain away in a simple game review article or maybe an article in National Geographic, which is probably appropriate because it's just a game that really talks about nature a lot. Now, on the other hand, there were some genuinely fun surprise moments in the story and some very cool cutscenes that I don't want to spoil for you, so I'm sure you'll run into those and you'll know what I'm talking about at that point. With all that being said, I'm going to give the story a pretty harsh 6 out of 10 and say Monster Hunter still has a lot of improvements to make in this area of writing. Number 4, multiplayer. As you all probably know, I spend most of my time playing multiplayer, and I like to play group fights, especially if it means I can help players get through a fight that they're really struggling with, or just hosting a session for others to join. This really is the reason I get on and play Monster Hunter every day, so in that regard, Capcom's multiplayer has been a large success in the base game, and I don't see that changing with Iceborne. However, there are still some unanswered questions that I won't be able to comment on in this review. For example, will we be getting another siege monster? And what will we be doing in the endgame? I actually have a lot of faith in Capcom on this subject, because they've already done so well with Extreme Behemoth, Ancient Leshen, Kulve Taroth, but I won't be giving this subject a grade for now. It's just something to think about and maybe speculate on. Do you guys want to see another siege monster? What kind of end game rewards should there be? Should it just be decorations and maybe streamstones, or should it go a little further, maybe a little bigger than that? So those are questions to ask yourself, and we'll talk about rewards soon. Category number 5 is environment. I feel that the experience with the environment is a big selling point for Monster Hunter World. It's obvious Capcom has a very committed goal toward differentiating itself from other games by making you feel like you're really out in the wild hunting, and that you need to master your environment in order to be a competent player, and that's exactly right in this case. I feel that I'm constantly challenged to think about the monster's location, resources in those locations, interactive environmental mechanics that do more damage to my target, and even change the type of attacks that my weapons are able to use, such as ledges, right? The locations are also very beautiful, and this is especially true for Hoarfrost Reach. I think having a snow location actually balances out the variety of experiences you get to have in the game, and it's just a detail-packed, dense experience that could only take a very long time to create, and I think they've basically nailed it in this case. There aren't a lot of games that I've played that have gotten so much right about the environment. There's also a lot to see and pay attention to while you're running around from location to location. You're often grabbing important ingredients like a kleptomaniac, and there's especially a good feeling when you've memorized the map so well that you know where these ingredients are without really having to think about it, right? Gathering from a mechanical point of view is also a nice and fast experience, and you even find yourself hunting endemic life, which is just like bugs and cute little things you get to put in your room later. A part of the challenge of memorizing these maps is also realizing how vertically complex they are and how many hidden paths there are, often having a top floor and a bottom floor and shortcuts, wedge beetles that let you move around better, right? So really we have to give Capcom credit where credit is due on their environmental design with a 10 out of 10. Also, one of the questions you might have about the environment is there enough of it? Do we get enough environment in Monster Hunter World Iceborne? The answer is yes. Category number 6, weapon and armor rewards. This is also a really important subject and probably one that I'll spend most of my time in the coming year talking about and analyzing and thinking about. Weapons and armor in Monster Hunter World are your rewards for playing, and since this is a PvE game, not only does the interactive fight you have with the monster have to feel good, but also there has to be some kind of prize and reward for you to go back out and pursue it again, right? That's the reward loop. When I first got to Celiana and got to talk with the smithy, what made me really happy was seeing all of the upgrade trees for the weapons. One of the key problems in Monster Hunter World base game is that we had just a few weapons dominating the build meta, and once you had earned those weapons, there really wasn't much else for you to do except to either help others play or to speedrun. Hopefully, in Iceborne, there is a more developed reward system for the end game, and especially I talk about the need for a highly priced possession for players to go after in the end game. Sometimes I use the term white whale for that. This is both a bragging rights kind of item and also something that you'll want to use because it's the most powerful XYZ in the game, right? So you get to wear it in the Gathering Hub. Everyone's like, oh, dang, he's got the blah, blah, blah. And also it's just really strong, right? And maybe it could be designed so that you can only use it once per day. Maybe it can be designed so that it degrades over time and you can't repair it, but just something worth pursuing. When I started getting a glimpse at the endgame upgrades for the weapons, my initial reactions were very similar to the reactions I had in the base game, and that was, I wonder which one of these is going to be the strongest, because they can't all be the strongest. I'm hoping the new balance changes do, though, really make it more viable to build multiple elemental and ailment setups for every weapon class, and I'm looking forward to diving deeper into the weapons and the armor into Iceborne, as I have done with the base game. I think for weapons and armor, we should also hold back on giving out a final grade, because the end game has to be explored more before we can comment on the diversity of gameplay experiences had by them, as well as whether or not the rewards are enough to keep you playing. However, I am going to subtract at least 1 point from the grade, and that's because I would have expected Capcom to introduce at least one new weapon to the game. I know they added the Clutch Claw, but I consider that to be more of a universal mechanic, or, like an additional move to each weapon. Category number 7 is music. Oh boy. So music, like sound effects, is another really big one for me. They're part of the same group, actually. When I say 1/3 of the game, I'm talking about both music and sound effects. So again, this is 1/3 of your game right here. Lucky for Capcom, after playing their campaign, I have their new main theme stuck in my head, even as I'm writing this review, which is exactly what you would hope for from your video game soundtrack. I did actually pay very close attention to how the music in the game was making me feel and how it was presented, and I do have some feedback on it. I think there should be a few very ambient tracks that can play intermittently in your activities even during combat. One of the problems I ran into is that even when the music was actually very good, for example, I'm a big fan of the Basilgeuse theme, but if you have to listen to the Basilgeuse theme for too long, like let's say 40 minutes, then you're going to get tired and fatigued from listening to it because it's too busy of a sound for your brain to have to hear for on replay for like 50 minutes. This was a trick that I believe Minecraft seemed to realize as well. At some point in one of Minecraft's major updates, it did a thing where it stopped playing the music so much, and that's because it realized the player would become fatigued from listening to too much music, and that's something that I think Capcom should be considering. They should have one of their music, whoever works on their music design, have him sit down, put on a pair of headphones, and then listen to the Basilgeuse music on a loop for 50 minutes and don't do anything else, just 50 minutes. And I think at that point, they'll realize some of their customers will have that experience of hearing that music for just that long because they'll time out on the combat timer. So I'm recommending maybe 5 or 6 ambient music battle tracks that can have the mechanical functions of the monster themes, right? They have a mechanical function to them. For example, when the monster leaves to another area, the music stops playing. So you have to have the music because the music actually gives you feedback about what's going on in the fight. But again, maybe have some ambient battle tracks that you can swap out to when the game recognizes that the player's been playing for, I don't know, maybe like 5 hours, and they realize, the game is capable of realizing that the player's stuck in a very long fight against somebody like Basilgeuse. It kicks in that ambient battle track, and then the player doesn't experience that fatigue. That's just something that I noticed. Other than that, I would say some of the returning tracks from the older games are really going to impress players who know them, and even players who've never heard them before. They're very epic, and the main theme and the music that plays in the credits was really nice and fits the mood of Iceborne. On another note, I think if there were more moments in the story that elicited feelings of grief, loss, depression, this would also give Capcom an opportunity to capitalize on music with a sad mood, something that I think a lot of games tend to overlook and miss out on as a form of art and storytelling, and the games that do capitalize on this, they tend to be remembered because of that, okay? It's just, I don't know why it gets overlooked. People forget that humans experience sadness. I'm going to be giving Capcom an 8 out of 10 on the music. This is more of a subjective grading, of course, but I think there's room for improvement. Similar to the sound effects, we're looking for some music that could become iconic. Capcom needs its own Gerudo Valley or Streets of Whiterun, something people instantly recognize and are overwhelmed with feelings and sentiments that are experienced on a deeper level than the game itself. And that probably sounds like I'm asking for a lot, but I think Capcom is actually on the cusp of achieving this based on the current quality of the music that they're producing for Iceborne, and that they really should just reach a little bit further if they can. Category number 8, replayability. Replayability is actually one of the most important selling points for games these days, since gaming has become a way of life for people. It's a lifestyle, didn't you know that? People will game anywhere from an hour to 8 hours a day and more. Like me, I probably game for about 8 hours a day. And so when developers are designing a game, they have to keep in mind just how long people will actually want to sit down and grind that game without experiencing boredom after very unhealthy, very long periods of time. With Iceborne, once again, it's just a bit early to give this category a grade, but one of the best indicators of the replayability of a game can be how thick the game is with this content. And I would say that Iceborne, by the time I stopped playing to write the review, was feeling very, very thick. It was dummy thick. But that's about all I know about the replayability. Another thing that can give a game high replayability is just how difficult the game is. And I can say that the Iceborne expansion definitely steps up on the complexity of the attacks that the monsters are using, which in turn does make the game more difficult as well, but in a satisfying way, which is something we'll talk further about in the mechanics category. Right? So people have talked about bullet sponges. Bullet sponges are where nothing about the monster has changed. They just raise the health of the monster and they make the attacks do more damage, and that's it. Well, Capcom hasn't necessarily done that in Iceborne. What they've done is they've actually given the monsters scarier attacks, faster attacks, and more complex attacks. So we can speculate about the replayability based on what we had in World. Obviously, the most replayable fight was the Kulve fight, and that's because she played like an event out of Destiny, where you could waste hours and hours and never get the weapon you're looking for. I can't figure out if that means Kulve was a success or not. It just depends on who you ask, probably. I think over time, I started to feel like I was a masochist going after my very last Kulve reward, even though the fight was punishingly boring after what was probably getting close to like 500 attempts. Behemoth also had a replayability problem, but it was kind of like on the flip side. It was different. Behemoth, he was actually one of the best fights in the game, one of the best feeling fights. But once you had the Draken armor set, you were basically done. You didn't have any other reason to fight him. And Extreme Behemoth wasn't any better. You'd get the layered Dragon armor set and a title and you were done. So Kulve gets played 500 times by everyone. Behemoth, one of the best fights in the game. You play him like 2 or 3 times. You don't even need to defeat him, honestly. And then you're done. You're just done with them. So there's this huge imbalance in diversity of experiences with replayability. And this was a big problem in the base game world. I'm hoping Iceborne does not have this problem. One of the things that I had called for in the past was for Kulve loot pool to be shared amongst all of the endgame fights. But then why would people continue wanting to play Kulve at that point? And there you see Capcom's dilemma. Because in order for Kulve to be fun, you have to have a large group of people participating at the same time in a Kulve siege, which means in order to make her playable, they had to keep throwing newer and better loot into her loot pool, and this would make the player population return over and over again. I would like to see Capcom avoid this problem in the future. I also think they should consider just no more RNG weapons altogether and to strictly have crafting weapons. I know in their past games they have done RNG weapons, but I feel like it's more of their brand to actually craft the weapon. This is one of the things where they feel different from games like Borderlands and Destiny, right? So it's just something they should think about in terms of differentiating themselves from other games. Right? You can still make it hard for people to craft their favorite weapons by manipulating the RNG on rare drops, and even better than that, they could have a team that comes in with balance changes to underplayed weapons so that you always have something to come back to and work toward unlocking. So instead of dropping, like 50 new Kulve weapons, we could have just had the weapons no one was using become buffed, and then you would go back into the game and try to unlock those weapons. But I don't know, it's always easy to talk about, much harder to execute. I don't want to be too critical on this issue. And once again, we won't be grading the replayability of Iceborne because it hasn't been out long enough for us to really understand what is the replayability of the expansion. Alright, so in Category 9, we're going to be talking all about monsters in a game titled Monster Hunter. Most games have you move through a variety of henchmen and trash mobs, and then finally you reach the boss, and there's a prolonged fight that tests your skill, and you really don't fight that boss again anymore. I mean, there's exceptions, right? Whereas in Monster Hunter, you mostly don't have henchmen or trash mobs, you just go straight into a big prolonged fight with a monster larger than you, so the quality of the game is all dependent on the quality of each monster, and you might think of those monsters as bosses, if you're going to be kind of changing their labels around, but understanding effectively what they are. Since I had never played a monster title before World, I was really surprised by the quality of the monster fights. This is one of the key elements of the game that's making Capcom stand out from its competitors. However, as time went by, and again, I played like 3,000 hours, I went back and I played GU as well, by the way, my perception of these monsters became more nuanced, and so I have some of my own thoughts about what Capcom can do to stay ahead in terms of design and innovation in their game. So I think a monster can mostly be broken down into two parts, style and substance. Style is the player experience where the visuals, the sounds, and the animations of the monster are so enjoyable that you would fight that monster just because it's like interacting with a piece of art. One of the things I like about Iceborne is that it actually moved toward a more eccentric skin design on the monsters. The goal is to find a balance between fantasy and realism, and in Iceborne, Capcom dips further toward fantasy, I would say. In fact, without spoiling anything, I think one monster's design in particular is going to blow some of your minds, and it's going to be a really memorable fight. I know that that fight is stuck in my head, and it makes me think about the game, remember the game, and want to go back to the game. That's that addictive feeling, and when a game does that, it's really accomplished something special and successful. That's especially true for someone like me because I've been gaming as a lifestyle for like 20 years. So I can really tell when I've moved away from playing a game, I put it away, and my brain says, hey, you got to go play that game. I'm real sensitive to that because it's hard for me to feel that feeling anymore. I've built up a lot of resistance to that feeling over the years. Capcom succeeded with doing that in one of the fights in Iceborne, so there's really good news. And then there's the other side of the monster design equation, and that would be the substance. And I think this is where Capcom could use some improvements. I'm pretty sure the community is going to quickly point out two things that they would like to see worked on. One is going to be new monster skeletons, and two is going to be new monster movesets. Even though the monsters feel like they have a unique style, they just don't feel different enough somehow to the fights that we've had in the base games. Movesets also is an important issue. It feels like Capcom has created a list of movesets for itself. Here's the tailspin, here's the fireball, and then it mostly just pulls from this list when designing a new monster. And then they'll add one or two new moves to that monster, or they'll edit the already existing move to be a bit different, but it's not truly different. A lot of games do this actually, because the cost of having to create truly fresh attack animations and attack values and how those values interact with literally everything in the game, it takes a crazy amount of time and money and labor to do this, but it's also the most important aspect of giving the player a new experience. And to the player, that's what they think about when they're buying. So Capcom should be very careful not to underestimate how sensitive players are to recycled content. Now, with all that being said, I was mostly making a point about how we should be grading the experience. I haven't actually handed out a grade. I'm going to give Capcom a 9 out of 10 for its monsters in Iceborne. It would be a straight 10 out of 10 if I saw some really new, really innovative monster skeletons that we'd never seen before, not just Gamut or Mizazune, which everyone is calling for, right? The Leviathan skeleton, Elephant skeleton. Those are from the old games, and a lot of veterans have already experienced that. I'm talking about something truly new. I do think a lot of the veterans are definitely going to feel that the developers for Iceborne are kind of reaching a new mastery of their craft in the sense that they understand at a deeper level the interactive experience that is being had by the player. And this allows the developers to tweak and design new weapons and new experiences with the monsters that the player wants to return to and try to master themselves. The ring attack and lava floor from Arch-Tempered Zenitjiva in the base game, this has been a terrific example of that. And now I think Capcom should try to create even more of these new moves and have it be of the same unusually high quality. As a last note, I think that Capcom should be working on a variant or subspecies of the Ancient Leshen, because the Ancient Leshen is the only humanoid skeleton fight in the game, and it was one of the freshest feeling pieces of DLC they had launched in the base game. And finally, we're moving on to game mechanics. This is going to be category number 10, the most important one in the game in my opinion. If it sounds kind of like a vague topic, it's not. It's because it can be used to describe a lot of things. However, I'm speaking specifically about the RPG elements of the game, the changes to the weapons, and the new Clutch Claw. Iceborne already has the advantage of being an expansion to a game with really strong game mechanics. There are a lot of RPG elements that are going to affect your damage when you swing something like your greatsword, and Iceborne gives the developers a chance to let us play with more diverse ranges of endgame builds. I realized, though, that I'm not going to be able to grade all of the new skills in Iceborne, precisely because even after playing it for a really long time, I know I have not unlocked all of them probably, and I certainly haven't tested them all for any prolonged period of time by any means. So the RPG mechanics have to go ungraded, but based on what I saw is much like the rest of the categories in this Iceborne review. To me, it's obvious a lot of thought and careful decision making has gone into improving on the things we already had in World. What we do know is that there were some much needed nerfs to the affinity skills, making them more complicated, some buffs to the elemental damage, a nerf to raw damage, and some buffs to defensive skills. All of these decisions are exactly what I would have done myself, and it's a very promising move from Capcom for them to be making. Since Monster Hunter is an RPG style of game where you have to build your character loadout, a lot of your time can be spent just sitting around trying to put together an appropriate build, and when you finally do and it makes the fight significantly, like a really tough fight significantly easier, this is a big part of the experience of the game. It's really important. Now, besides the RPG elements, new movesets are here to be analyzed as well. Thanks to the Iceborne beta, I was able to test a lot of the weapons multiple times to get a feeling for the changes that have been made to them. Some of the least popular weapons like Hunting Horn and Gunlance have received multiple improvements. However, I'm still waiting to see if any more changes are made to the Lance, which is one of the weapons that would compete with the Hunting Horn for the title of least used weapon. I also would have liked to see maybe one more new move on the dual blades. All of the other weapons feel like they've received significantly fun improvements, especially the longsword and the hunting horn. Let's talk about the clutch claw. One of the things I liked most about the clutch claw is that now we can jump on the monster anytime we want to. We don't just have to mount, we can actually just clutch claw and voila, you're on the monster. So I found this to be a really fun idea, and it can actually even feel addicting to use, like you just want to play around with it and know how good it is. And that's a good sign. However, I'm still debating with myself how much I like the amount of damage it does. If it does too little, people will see using the clutch claw as maybe like a required chore that you have to do in order to get a wounded part, and then you just don't use clutch claw anymore. If it does too much, then it ends up replacing your current weapon's optimal moveset, and then instead of using your weapon, you're a clutch claw main, right? That's what everyone jokes about. I think Capcom has a very delicate balance between those two thresholds right now, too much, too little. And I'm leaning more to the side that I'm debating if it's too strong. Because yes, it does do some damage initially, but it's actually the monster part debuff that makes clutch claw a meta part of your moveset. Think about it, not only do you do more damage to that body part, weakness exploit is going to kick up to 50. So using the clutch claw is basically mandatory. That's what's going to happen. So this causes me to run into a new issue, and that's how much of my thought process I have to commit to thinking about what to do with the clutch claw while I'm playing, when it's not even the weapon that I chose. One of the core elements to Monster Hunter World is that you get to pick which weapon you're going to be playing with, and then you master the moveset on that weapon and become very skilled with it, and in your mind during the fight, normally you would just focus all of your attention on reacting properly with that weapon. The spacing, your timing, recovery frames, having to dodge through a monster's move and punish the monster. Now it feels like I'm trying to be skilled with two weapons at the same time. Both my weapon and this other thing that I certainly did not choose, the clutch claw. Everyone has the same clutch claw, and if I don't master it, then I'm going to lose out on damage. So I find myself thinking less about my longsword and more about my clutch claw, and I actually didn't like that feeling. It's a lot like suddenly being asked to dual wield two weapons in every hunt, and sometimes I just want to go back to only thinking about the weapon that I actually chose. So I think Capcom should be careful about introducing a mechanic that feels a little bit forced and perhaps too much like dual wielding two weapons at once. Maybe one of the things Capcom could introduce is the ability to choose between different types of clutch claws, like maybe one that is harder to use but does have even more damage, or one that is very easy to use but does almost no damage, but gives you the wounded monster part, the debuff. And this would allow players to choose what level they want the clutch claw to be involved with their other weapon. Whatever the case is, I'm still forming my opinion on it, because I know when a new mechanic is introduced, usually the veteran players will be the first ones to not like it because they're so familiar with the way the game already used to be, and I'm trying to not fall into that trap and remain objective about this and open to innovation and change. I'm going to be generous and give Iceborne a whopping 10 out of 10 for game mechanics. They've really made a game with no bugs dense with complex information and mechanics to learn, dummy thick, and developers with a very deep understanding of what the human mind finds novel. This is something very, very few game companies ever accomplish, and it is essentially going to define a quality gaming experience from an amateur gaming experience. I think it's the reason Monster Hunter World has been such a large success for Capcom, and I'm sure Iceborne is going to be like this as well. If Capcom were smart, it would give its developers a raise, because I've seen strong AAA brands like Mass Effect and Destiny absolutely fall apart thanks to worse than expected game mechanics. Often there's other problems too, like in Destiny's case, a lack of content. Iceborne isn't going to have those problems. I also want to throw in that my top choice of collaboration would be between Capcom and FromSoft. And that's the end of my review. When we tally all the scores together, we get a 10 in polish, an 8 in sound effects, 6 in the story. Multiplayer is ungraded, environment is 10, weapon and armor rewards is still ungraded, music is an 8, replayability is ungraded, monsters are a 9, and mechanics are a 10. This turns into an 8.7 out of 10, so Iceborne gets an 8.7 out of 10. I think this is a very fair grade, and definitely recommend purchasing a copy of the expansion. The flaws that stuck out to me most is the lack of a new weapon, and that we haven't really seen any new monster skeletons that I know of. I really would have liked that. Obviously, if that changes in the later through free DLCs like they did with the base game, that's going to bring the grade up to like a 9. We don't actually know what we're going to be getting, like a year from now. What impressed me the most about the game were the monster designs, the difficulty, the polish, and especially when the game picks up later in the story. And we'll see those together later when I stream the expansion live, so I hope you'll join me for that on September 6th. If you enjoyed this review, let me know if you watched it to the end and consider sharing it. I'm going to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.